So yes, indeed, responding to a question in the chat. And for those of you who are here, no Git pull today. So today we're taking a little break from Python code. So you may have noticed that that was not posted to the repository. I'm sorry, I should have made an announcement about that ahead of time so you didn't stress about it. We're going to be, taking a little bit of a different turn today and talking about the ethics of data science. So this is just going to be a PowerPoint, and I'll put that on Canvas afterwards for you guys to have access to. I'm not going to put it in the public repository just because I've taken materials from from another source that I'll discuss in a bit, and I just don't want to put it in a publicly accessible place. But I'll put it on Canvas so you can have. Okay. All right. So why don't we get started? Actually, let me see if I've got my, no, I don't have my good mask today. I think I just have to wear this one. Okay. I think this mask allows me to speak a little bit more clearly, so I'll switch to that. Any questions before we get started? Yeah.
Is the homework due this Friday or next Friday?
So I believe it's due this Friday. I can double check in the.
On Canvas, it says it's due on the 25th edition. What that was like.
No, whatever, it should be whatever is right on Canvas, but I can double check that for you just to be sure. But it's probably, I think we may have pushed the date back a little because we have, well, the material today is not so relevant for the homework, so it may have pushed back when the next due date will be. And I think that is correct. Let me just double check the spreadsheet. Yeah, so the due date for homework 5, we're going to skip a week, and you have 2 weeks for that one. So that's good, right? Yay. You deserve it. It's been a lot of homeworks. Okay, so indeed, no homework due this Friday. So it'll be, next homework will be due a week from Friday. Okay, so like I said, we're going to be taking a little detour from Python and hardcore data analysis to talk about the ethics of data science. And I should give a little disclaimer here that I am not an expert in ethics. So I'm sure you can find other professors more knowledgeable on this topic. But this is kind of something that I guess everybody in data science has kind of been thrown into, whether they are an expert in it or not. What's the little Spider-Man quote? With great power comes great responsibility, right? So with access to a lot of data that's impacting policy and all of these things, there is a lot of power in that. And with that does come the responsibility to think about how it's going to affect other people. And so that's why we feel like it's important, even in an intro class, to talk about this, because it's just something that we should be starting the conversation on early so that we can think about how our analysis is going to impact others. Okay, so like I said, because I am not an expert in this, I actually borrowed the materials from today's lecture are taken from a course. It's a free course at the University of Michigan in data science ethics. And you can actually register for this for free. I'm gonna, give a little preview and go over some of the material and case studies, but there's a lot more there. So if you're interested in this, I encourage you to check this out. And I think you can access all of these materials for free for 4 weeks. And then if you want longer, you can get a subscription. Okay, so this was, like I said, taken from a course at the University of Michigan, taught by Dr. Jagadish, and you can enroll to check out all of the materials. I'll put the slides on Canvas afterwards. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today are a couple of things. First of all, what are ethics? What do we mean by that? Then we're going to talk about informed consent, who owns the data, data ownership, algorithmic fairness, and hopefully societal consequences if we get that far. There's a lot of relevant and interesting stuff that we won't have time to get to today, but we're gonna get a good start. Okay, so first of all, what are ethics? Maybe I'll throw that out there to you guys. What do you think ethics are? My Zoom people can answer too, or type something in the chat. Yes. A standard of morality that you're adhering to. Other thoughts? So when I hear standard of morality, I think some notion of right and wrong, right? We have some sense of what's right and what's wrong. And then that we're adhering to actually gets at the point of there's some kind of consensus, societal consensus around, okay, we're all gonna, agree to act or not act a certain way. And I think you're hitting on some of the actually really key points of what ethics is. So basically shared principles, so some kind of shared code of conduct, shared principles that help us distinguish right from wrong. And ethics are really important in building a civilization. So they're really the cornerstone of civilization. Without ethics, we wouldn't really function as a society. And so it's the basis for the rules that we voluntarily choose to follow to make the world a better place for everybody as a whole. Okay, so ethics is basically what prevents me from stealing your wallet, even though maybe I could, maybe you're smaller than I am, or maybe I'm not going to get caught, but there's still some underlying principle that prevents people most of the time from not stealing somebody else's wallet. Of course, there are exceptions. Okay, so a couple of things that ethics isn't. Ethics is not religion, although these things are often correlated. So most religions do promote ethical behavior, with principles such as thou shalt not steal, etc. But ethics need not be religious. It just flows from shared values, which could be on account of religion or could not be on account of religion. So it's different from religion. And ethics are also not laws. So, we may, for example, if I tell you a secret and ask you not to tell anybody, and then you turn around and for no good reason tell my secret to all of our friends, I think we would all agree that that was not a nice thing to do, that was unethical, but there's no law against it, right? So ethics is also different from laws. There are things that are definitely legal to do, but which would be generally agreed upon to be unethical. Okay, so ethics guides the creation of laws. So the two are often connected, but still it's different, and we may have things, that are unethical but legal. And we do know that not everyone will be ethical, even when there are shared values. So occasionally somebody will steal your wallet and perhaps go to jail for theft. Okay. So in general, the general principle is that there should be an economic benefit for ethics. So for the most part, society as a whole does best when each individual works to maximize their own benefit. So that's usually when society functions well, when you're working to maximize your benefit and it lines up with the system. But there are situations where what's good for you as a person, as an individual, is not necessarily what's the best thing for society as a whole. And that's where, ethics and shared societal value systems come in to address these situations. So a famous example of this is known as the tragedy of the commons. So let's say you have some land and you have your own private land where you graze your sheep. And then there's this common area, beautiful, grassy, and you would like to also graze your sheep on the commons in addition to your own land. But if everybody did that, what would happen? Turns into a wasteland, right? So if everybody did that, it would turn into a wasteland. And so then there are principles that we agree on. Okay, well, we're not going to let that happen. Even though I want to graze my sheep on the land, I know that if everybody did that, it would be a disaster. And so we are going to hold these principles that it's actually best for everybody if nobody grazes on the common land. Okay, so this is how we get basically to the economic value of ethics. So what would be, how do these ethical principles arise? Well, they arise basically when the cost to me of following the rule is less than the benefit to me from others following the rule. Like overall, it's better for me if everybody follows the rule. Does that make sense? Okay, so it basically makes people want the rule on average, even if there is a cost to me. That cost is less than what it would be if nobody followed the rule. Okay. Okay, so if we all agree, so we find these benefits from following the rules, which are these ethical principles. So for example, if we all agree to drive on the right side of the road, that's good for everybody. Like it might be nice if you could drive wherever you wanted, but that would be chaos. And at the end of the day, it's better for you to have the rules. Okay, same with litter. I'll just skip that example. Okay, so just to kind of summarize, what are ethics? Ethics are shared rules we all agree to follow because of the resulting benefits, often infused with a sense of right and wrong. And in this lecture, we'll talk a little bit about, well, we've already talked about what ethics are and why we're all better off with ethical behavior. But then we're going to move into talking a little bit more specifically about how this affects data science. Okay, so ethics matter in data science because there is an impact on humans. That's basically why it's important. And so to understand how people have thought about this historically, it's important to understand something called human subjects research and the concept of informed consent. Okay, so this is a good example to kind of illustrate what we're talking about here. This is the Tuskegee study, sort of an infamous study. And this was a study conducted between 1932 and 1972 in Macon County, Alabama. And the study consisted of 600 impoverished Black sharecroppers. About 400 of them had syphilis and about 200 did not. The goal of the study was to analyze the effects of untreated syphilis. How would the disease progress? What were the characteristics of the disease? And in exchange for participating in the study, the participants were given free health care and hot meals. So that might sound well and good, but what was the problem? Well, the problem was that around 1947, penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis. So it was standard medical protocol to treat syphilis with penicillin, but nobody told the participants of the study that that was the case, even though they were specifically studying syphilis. No one told them about the standard treatment or, gave them that option to get the standard treatment. So subjects were never informed about this. And in 1972, this led to a public outcry, which ended the study. And so this incident, and probably other similar incidents, were very foundational in the formation of what is now institutional review boards. So what is an institutional review board? Institutional review boards basically provide rules governing human subjects research. If you're going to do research involving humans, it has to be approved by an IRB. Well, I should say in certain contexts, it has to be approved. And at the heart of these rules governing what IRB regulates is a principle of informed consent. So this is sort of now the standard of what has to be true in research, is we have to have informed consent in a study. So what does that mean? What does informed consent mean? It means that when we're doing human subject research, the human subject must be informed about the experiment, must consent to the experiment voluntarily without coercion, and must have the right to withdraw consent at any time. Okay, so if we think about the Tuskegee study and whether these criteria were met, were the participants informed about the study? No, they were not, right? When the standard treatment came out, they were not informed about that standard treatment and option. Did they consent to the experiment? Yes, they did enroll in the study voluntarily, so that part was true. And they must have the right to withdraw consent at any time. Was that true? Well, it's a little hard to say, so that's maybe a little unclear. No one told them they could withdraw at any time. So they may have assumed that they couldn't. It's a little unclear. Okay, so what was really, really problematic in the study was that, there's some kind of balancing act going on between benefit and harm. Does the harm done to the participants, is it outweighed by the benefit to society, by the advance in medical knowledge that we're going to get from the study? And that, assessment of whether the harm outweighed the benefit was done by the experimenter. And that's generally now considered to be not appropriate, not ethical, that the experimenter cannot be the person to make that call, that you need an independent third party who's doing that assessment. Okay. So this has led to the formation of institutional review boards, which consist of diverse members, and not just scientists, but also non-scientists who would, be able to, I think speak to how it's impacting humans, or some non-scientific aspects that should be considered. And these boards approve human subject study. And so they are the ones who sort of do the balancing between the potential harm and benefit, harm to subjects versus benefits to society. And sometimes, sometimes you have cases where participants in a research study cannot be completely informed. This happens a lot in psychology if you want to study certain psychological effects, or, it may not always be appropriate for the participants to know exactly what's going on, but those still have to be approved by an IRB to make that call. Okay, so one kind of important thing so this is a really important concept, that for human subjects research, you have to get this approval, this IRB approval, and it leads to a notion of prospective data collection, where you really outline, what's your study? What are you proposing to do? How are you proposing to collect this data ahead of time? And then it gets approved and you actually collect the data. And this is required for all government-funded experiments involving humans. But it does not apply to business. Okay, so this is a requirement only for research and not for business. So the business world, in which a lot of data science operates, is in some sense a lot less regulated than academia and other research institutions that are subject to these regulations. So, and that's one reason why it's important that we think about it. Okay, so what's an example of that? One example that we mentioned in class is A/B testing, where a company is trying to, they want to come up with the best product that they can. They want to test between two options, A and B. They send 50% of their clients or customers to website A and 50% to B. Then they track their behavior, see how many of them make a purchase or enter an email address or something else desirable. And then, compare the two numbers to decide whether to go with option A or B. Okay, so this is standard. It's used across the board in business and industry, and particularly by companies with high customer volume. Okay, so is this human subjects research? Web companies do this all of the time, and human users are impacted, right? They're given a different experience. They're changing what they view, what they have access to. So it is impacting humans. And companies often try to push our buttons, right? To engage us emotionally in a certain way to elicit a certain behavior. And companies often will, well, they don't always, they're not perfect also. So the algorithms that they deploy are not perfect. And sometimes they give us, poor results and not what we're looking for. So in some sense, yes, there is an impact to humans, excuse me, but this would not be considered human subjects research in the classic sense. This is generally considered just sort of standard, normal business operating procedure. Okay, but it starts to get, less and less clear. So with A/B testing, we've generally come to a consensus as a society that that's fine and that's standard business practice. But you can kind of keep going a little bit further until it gets a little unclear. So one kind of famous example is the Facebook Cornell experiment. And so what happened here was that Facebook actually, they were curious about if you're exposed to negative news articles and stories, are you going to be affected by that? Are you going to post more negative comments, etc.? On the other hand, if you're exposed to like positive streams and positive news articles, are you going to post more positive things? So they wanted to investigate this artifact known as emotional contagion, like how susceptible are we in our emotions and what we post to our feeds and that are coming in. So they actually manipulated users' feeds. So with one group, they manipulated their feeds to be especially positive, and with another group, they manipulated their feeds to be especially negative. And then they tracked their behavior and compared. Okay, so this is interesting, but some people were definitely upset by this, that Facebook was manipulating the algorithm for a certain behavior, and maybe the users hadn't consented to that. Now the user agreement permits Facebook to use data for research, which was made explicit in 2012. So this is one example where there was less consensus on whether it was appropriate for Facebook to do that. A little more unclear than for A/B testing. Okay. And so let's take a look. I'm going to come back to this slide actually, but let's take a look. Let's go even further and look at one more case study for a company called OkCupid. I'm actually going to switch here to a video, which we'll watch together, and then we'll discuss this. Okay, so here we go.
Matchmaking companies exist on the web. OkCupid is one of them. The way these things work is customers sign up, enter a profile, and the company tries to find compatibility between user profiles based on what you told about yourself. You'll be recommended people to meet that the company thinks might be compatible with you. Determining compatibility is, of course, extremely difficult, and a company like OkCupid has a proprietary algorithm to try to predict this compatibility. They do so by means of developing a compatibility score that is computed through some proprietary function of all the things that you have in your profile. Of course, they're trying all the time to improve their algorithm, improve the predictive power of the compatibility score that they create. And for this purpose, they're constantly monitoring how well they do. They're constantly tinkering with the algorithm, trying to improve it, change some weights, change some parameters. And some of these changes may be successful and may be adopted, others may be rolled back. And so in this sense, if you're a user of a website like OkCupid, you're constantly being experimented upon in that what you're experiencing is an algorithm that is perpetually in development. Now, OkCupid actually took this thing a couple of steps further. They tried slightly bigger experiments. So for example, the thing that they started to do was something called the Love is Blind Day. And on this day, they would suppress photographs in user profiles. And what this meant was that you would not be able to see the profile photographs of potential people to meet. You would, of course, be able to read what they had written in their profile in terms of their interests and other text actions. What they found was that even though as humans, we all very much care about photographs, and that is likely to be a large part of the input in terms of our deciding if somebody looks interesting and attractive, that not having those profile pictures actually resulted in more conversations, more dates, and in that sense, their platform was actually more successful on this day, on the Love is Blind Day. So taking this kind of counterintuitive success another step further, OkCupid decided to try an experiment where they wanted to understand the impact on the success of a date of simply being told that you were compatible. And so what they did was took people who were actually not very compatible, had a low compatibility score, and falsely told them that they had a high compatibility score just to bring people together. Conversely, they also took people who had a high compatibility score and told them they had a low compatibility score. And they actually did a 3x3 matrix of this sort, with 30, 60, and 90% compatibility score, actual versus 30, 60, 90% declared. And what they found was the success rate was the highest when people were compatible and were told they were compatible, that is at the 90-90 entry of this matrix. And it was lowest where they were not compatible and were told they were not compatible at 30-30 entry of this matrix. That if people were not compatible, but were told they were compatible, they actually did pretty well. And in fact, they did just as well as if they were compatible, but were told they were not. This is an interesting insight into human behavior. And this experiment was reported by the CEO of OkCupid in a blog post. When he reported this, he was cured on the internet by a whole range of people. And fundamentally, what this says is, in doing this experiment, interesting as it might be, that OkCupid broke the unwritten expectations of society. The CEO, Christian Drucker, obviously didn't agree with this general social consensus, or maybe there wasn't enough of a social consensus that he and other people like him would think it perfectly acceptable to do what they did in terms of reporting compatibility scores that were intentionally incorrect. Really, what we're doing here is, I think, socially drawing a line between experiments that companies conduct in the normal course of business because they're trying to improve their product or improve their algorithm. And yes, sometimes hope for improvements may turn out not to be improvements. Sometimes companies actually tell you something completely wrong, but that's unintentional. And that kind of thing we accept as just the way the world is. On the other hand, having a company intentionally lie to you, intentionally give you a wrong score, is something that most people would consider socially unacceptable. And because of this particular experiment and the discussions that followed, I would say that this is a matter on which there is greater social consensus today than there was at the time that OkCupid actually did conduct this experiment.
Okay. Okay, so I thought that was indeed an interesting case study. Any thoughts on that? What do you guys think? Is that crossing the line? I see some nods. Anybody want to argue otherwise?
It's hard to say just because whatever they're using as a compatibility standard is also very subjective, right? So
Right.
they come up with what they think will make two humans compatible, which might not actually be, which is what they designed with their the way they run the business, their proprietary algorithm or whatever.
Yeah, right.
So tweaking it back is kind of really tweaking with something that's so subjective.
Right. And that maybe that was part of their motivation. Like maybe it's just helpful to tell people that they're compatible or to like, you know, sort of inflate the compatibility scores, right?
Especially with the results, if you're compatible and you say you're not, the same as if you're not compatible until you are. So
Right.
maybe that just means that their entire algorithm is subjective.
Yeah.
Like you're signing up hoping that it's not, but you're already taking that into consideration.
Yeah. And I could see how well that could potentially inform a business practice because maybe they do that experiment and then maybe they decide, you know what, it's if you're in that middle range, it's not helpful to say anything, you know, like maybe you tell users, you know, like a green flag or a red flag, you know, if you're like have a really high score, a really low score, but in the middle, maybe you don't say anything. So I could see how they might argue, no, this might help us improve our product. But there's, you know, we have this like outcry from being lied to, like it's true that, yeah, the algorithm may be bad. It may not be a very good predictor. But yeah, people get very upset about being intentionally lied to. Yeah, that's a great comment. Anybody else? Okay, so sort of as he was saying in the video, generally, I mean, it's taken some time for us as a society to start having these conversations and coming to consensus about what's right and wrong, or what we consider to be right and wrong socially. But you know, generally, there's a consensus that has evolved. That sort of A/B testing is, you know, we consider that to be sort of normal operating procedure, but intentionally lying to your customers is unacceptable, socially unacceptable. Okay, so we did that. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about data ownership. This is an interesting topic since our whole course is focused on data analysis. But who actually owns the data that we are analyzing? So for example, if somebody wrote a biography about you, do you actually have rights to that content? It is about you, but you didn't write it, somebody else wrote the book. And if you don't like what was written, unfortunately, there's really not a whole lot you can do about that unless there's actually content that is incorrect. And the same is true with photographs. Somebody might take an image, take a picture of you, and even though you are the subject of the photo, you actually do not own that photo. And there's certain restrictions on what can be done with a photo. You know, for example, you can't take it in certain places like your home, etc. And you can't use it in certain ways as an implied endorsement, etc. So there are restrictions, limits on what somebody could do with your picture, but still they would own that picture and you would not own that picture. Okay. And so of course, you know, people can take a picture and they can turn it into something unflattering. This is done all of the time. And it's, yeah, an easy way to take a picture and turn it into something that's misleading or demeaning. And of course, we all have days where we don't want somebody to take our picture, where maybe we're not at our best. And especially in this day and age where we have cameras and data being collected all the time, everywhere around us, it's actually very easy to dig up unflattering photos of anybody. Okay, so similar considerations actually apply to data as to like the example of like books and images. Similar principles apply to data, even though it's a bit more complicated for data. But just like there are limits with what can be done of a picture of you, there are limits with what can be done with data. But otherwise, the person who creates the data is free to record it and free to use it within those limits. Okay. However, like I said, the situation for data, it's a little bit more complicated than, say, for example, for an image. If you use an image, it's very easy to credit the source. You can display it, you can credit the owner. When you're dealing with data, however, it's sometimes very difficult to untangle exactly what came from what, right? You might get some data from one source, some data from another source. You might put it all together and make this big hodgepodge. And at the end of the day, what you end up with can be a little confusing to sort of figure out exactly what the source was and how to credit it. Okay. Okay, so it can take a great deal of effort to collect data, for sure, and even more effort to clean, validate, and standardize it to put it into a useful format. And so really the person who does all of that hard work of collecting and cleaning and curating the data is the person who owns that data. This data is actually an asset that they have rights to. Okay, and of course there's still certain limits on what can be done, just like there are limits on recording. We would sort of all agree that, you know, you can record, but it's wrong when there's a reasonable expectation of privacy. So not in all contexts, not say, for example, in the fitting room of clothing store. But beyond those sort of agreed upon limits on what, where, and what you can record, the person doing the recording has the rights to that use. Okay, and kind of the general principle that is kind of emerging in this era of big data is that it's better to limit the use of data than the actual collection of data. So that it's better to sort of, not limit what you're recording, but limit how it's used. Okay, and so that sort of has the benefit of the data is there when it's really needed, but hopefully we can avoid undesirable uses. Okay, let me maybe skip this in the interest of time so we can get on to some of our other topics here. Yeah, I'm going to skip that part. Okay, let's do one more case study and discuss that, and then we'll take our break. Okay, so here is a case study on data ownership.
Students care about how well professors teach. And when enrolling for a class, they would naturally like to find out a little bit about how good the professor is. To meet this need, there are several websites that have cropped up. For example, ratemyprofessors.com. On this website, students who have taken my class go in and enter their comments and their rating of me as a professor. Other students who are considering taking my class can go read these comments, look at these ratings, and then decide if I'm a good professor or if they should wait till the course is taught by somebody else or not take the class at all. In other words, what happens on this website and the data that's on this website has an impact on enrollments in my class and therefore potentially on my career as a professor. The thing is, this is intensely personal information about me, but it is about me said by somebody else and recorded on a third-party website that I have no control over, and in fact, in general, have very little interaction with. Now, the question is, what happens if there's data, the things that are said on this website that I object to? For example, suppose there is some student who's disgruntled. Let's say I caught some student cheating. They could go in and put a really nasty comment about me and rate me very low. Even worse, there isn't much that prevents them from getting 50 of their closest friends, let's say their frat buddies, to go in and do the same thing. And the net result of this kind of mass movement would be that my ratings on this site would plummet. If such a thing were to happen, I could presumably go and complain to the website, and possibly they would investigate, possibly they might do something. But it's really totally up to them and their processes, and I have no real recourse. But the data has been gathered by somebody else, and it is this somebody else who controls it. The data that a site like RateMyProfessors.com gathers is information that they could sell or rent to third parties, that they could do what they wish to with. It is about me, but it isn't mine. And keeping this distinction between who the data is about and who owns that data is important as we go through our discussions of privacy.
Okay, so yeah, I thought that was an interesting case study. A little frightening, right? When you think about certain things just being out of your hands, and this, yeah, distinction between, yeah, it's the data is about you, but you don't own it, and you have really no recourse. But I don't know. Can anybody any thoughts as to, you know, sort of that horrible situation described in the video? Can we prevent that? I mean, are there ways that we can prevent that from happening?
I think there's like a social dilemma of, because it's just, if you think about it, it's kind of like a consumer feedback. You know, as a student who's taking classes, they're, you know, so I'm hoping the majority, I think the intention of the website is just pure gathering of feedback on general courses, not on specific person or professors, but I guess
Right.
there's a very great line of, you know, what is personal and what is not.
Right. And the intention is good. I mean, overall, I think we'd agree, well, this is good, you know, feedback. And of course, we all want, you know, ratings like TripAdvisor and all of that stuff. Any other comments on it?
I think with websites like these, like, because I've used it before and I take it all with a grain of salt, just because I know that there are people that are probably like making comments about a professor just because they got a bad grade or just because something happened to them.
Right.
So I can see how it's like a bad thing in the eyes of the professor, but like when I use it, I'm not exactly thinking like, oh, this is exactly true about this.
Right. So you know to take these open source data sources with a grain of salt,
Yeah.
which is good. Yeah.
I also used it and it's mostly just like, what does the homework look like? What does the test look like? How do they grade tests? And yeah, you can usually tell if someone's just being malicious or not.
If someone is, yeah.
A lot of the information is just like, just so you know, they're very very stringent on tests. They don't
Right.
really give a whole lot, or it'll be like each column is worth 50 points, so you have a really good chance of getting all.
Yeah, yeah.
It's useful information. I don't know of any professors whose careers it's ruined. I don't know if that example is actually used in fact.
Yeah, that could be taking it a little bit far. But it does seem like there is a tension between, you know, making it really easy to collect data and making it really accessible, you know, and having some kind of quality control. Like, is this really a student at the university? Is this really a student in the class? And yeah, I think there is kind of a tension there between the accessibility and the integrity of the data that's being collected. And so it's just something to keep in mind also as, you know, you're studying data science and you may go into the, you know, you may one day be a part of the creation of some of these tools and how they're designed and how they're monitored. And so these will be things, you know, to think about, like how easy do you want to make that process? What kind of checks and balances should be in place? Any comments from my online people? I hope you don't feel like you're not actually in the discussion. Okay, why don't we take our 5-minute break since we're at 4:30? Let's take 5 minutes. We'll come back at, I guess, what, 4:34. And then we'll talk a little bit about algorithmic fairness. So this next topic's actually, yeah, really interesting and really important. So we'll come back in a few minutes and go over that. I'd like to just turn off that light without turning off those lights, but they seem to all be connected. Can you guys see the screen okay? Is it better with it off? Think it's okay? Okay. Okay, well, why don't we get started again as it's 4:34. So what we're going to be talking about next is another very important component of the ethics of data science. And this is something called algorithmic fairness. So when we hear algorithm, we think like totally fair, it's like some step-by-step process. And so that the data, speak for themselves, right? What could be more fair than to, let an algorithm decide something? But can algorithms be biased? What do you guys think? So I'm seeing lots of nods. So why? In what ways can an algorithm be biased?
I don't know like specifically, but I went to a talk one time where they were talking about how they were doing algorithms to like predict things on like human populations, and they were saying they had to put them through checks to make sure that it wasn't like biased towards one like ethnicity or one gender.
Right. Yeah, that's huge. We've talked a little bit about like training data, training your model on a certain data set. And so if you start off with training data that's not representative of the whole population, where certain groups are underrepresented or left out, then it is biased against them. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
I think an algorithm is only going to be as good as the person who coded it, right? And so if it's anyone of a certain ethnicity or class, it's probably just going to reflect their experience and what they think it needs to account for.
That's a good point. Yeah. So we can have also just like bad algorithms that aren't, that are poorly coded, that are not doing a good job, and that is totally true. So you could have sort of like a bias that's just from, okay, this was not the appropriate model, or this was not coded correctly, and all of that. But even if you had like the perfect programmer, and the perfect implementation, you can still run into these sources of bias. Okay, so one example, and what can tend to happen is that algorithms often will just kind of propagate the status quo. And so what's an example where this can happen? Well, let's say we have a company that is primarily male, so there's only 10% women employees, and there's a certain, good old boys culture in the company that makes it a little bit difficult for women to break in and to be successful in the company. And so let's say this company decides to come up with an algorithm to help them in their hiring. And so they develop an algorithm and they train it on their data, on their current data, based on their current and past employees. And so this algorithm kind of tends to score women candidates lower because, well, first of all, there weren't that many of them, and this company has a certain culture making it difficult for women to succeed. So those women weren't performing as well, and so it sort of scores women lower in this hiring algorithm. And so what's the result? Well, fewer women get hired in the future because they're being scored lower. And what does that do? Well, it contributes to a furthering of this good old boys culture, which makes it even more difficult for women to succeed. And so, and that makes it even more likely the algorithm is going to rate them lower, and it just goes on in a cycle, right? So this is one way in which algorithms, that are trained on current data tend to kind of propagate the status quo, right? If you're starting off with this bias situation, it can just kind of keep going. Okay. Yeah, let me skip that. Okay, and so algorithms can be biased, and also even if we have really good data, we can still do a bad analysis on it. And there's a couple of different ways where this can happen. And some of these things we've already talked about in class, but it's good to kind of go over them. Correlated attributes, correct but misleading results, and p-hacking are a few of them. Okay, so let's think a little bit about correlated attributes and the implications for and ethical implications in data science. So a good example to think about is racial discrimination. And basically, the idea here is that, well, universities are prohibited by law from considering race in admissions decisions. That's illegal. But it's not real hard, especially in the era of big data that we live in, to find surrogate features or attributes that are not race, but that can kind of be used as a proxy for race and use those in decisions. So for example, I think it was the University of Texas implemented a policy where they would offer admission to top 10% of high school students from any high school. And the effect of that was somewhat of an affirmative action effect, because there were some schools that were primarily minority or underrepresented groups, and those 10% of students were guaranteed admission. And so they were able to do that essentially by using a proxy attribute that was not explicitly based on race. And in the same way, a lender can do that. So even though it's illegal to decline, to not give somebody a loan on the account of race, it's not illegal to redline a whole zip code or a whole neighborhood. And so there's ways in which you can basically implement discriminatory policies based on proxy attributes. Okay. So, and like I said, this era of big data makes actually that increasingly easy to do because we have so much data. It's not hard to find these proxy attributes and to implement this proxy discrimination. And so then it basically becomes whether this technology is used appropriately becomes a matter of intent. Sometimes it's misused and sometimes it's not. But on the more positive side, all of this data that we have also gives us some tools to investigate and to try to detect if discrimination is occurring and to address it. So even though it's also can be the source of discrimination, it can also help detect and address discrimination as well. Okay. And a lot of times discrimination can happen unintentionally. It's not always the intent to discriminate, but a lot of times things have unintended consequences because people didn't think things through. And so this is another interesting case study that we'll get to in a minute, where this happened for the store Staples when they were doing geo-pricing. Okay, so intent matters, but is also not sufficient. Even with the best of intent, discrimination can still, we can still have discrimination. Okay, and so we've been throwing around this word a lot, discrimination. What is discrimination? Discrimination is when a target group is treated differently from everybody else. And this can basically happen at an individual level, where an individual from that target group is treated differently, or it can happen at an aggregate level where, as a whole group, this target group is treated differently. And so a lot of times discrimination, like I said, can be unintentional. It's not always the intent. This is a good illustration of also, yeah, sort of algorithmic fairness and discrimination and how they come together. But this was an experiment done by Carnegie Mellon University in 2015, and they investigated what ads were shown to people on the internet, and they showed that significantly fewer women were shown online ads for jobs that paid over $200,000 compared with men. So men on average were shown more ads for jobs over $200,000 and women were shown fewer. So this seems like clear discrimination, right? Against women, like they're not being shown the ads for high paying jobs. And yet it was not necessarily, well, no, I really don't think it was the intent of the algorithm to do that discrimination. You know, the algorithm was collecting whatever data or factors that it could and trying to, you know, generate ads they thought would be of interest to this person, but the effect was still discrimination. Okay, and another thing that can happen is correct but misleading results. So perhaps you've seen pictures like this if you've had an introductory course in statistics about how not to present your data. But this is, you know, for example, you might have the growth of a company over a 5-year period, and this is showing the exact same data, right? If you look, just change the y-axis here to go from 100 to 106 versus 0 to 100. So by messing with the axis, you can create this illusion of very rapid growth when the truth is really that, you know, there was very small amount of growth in this period. So we can play with the visualizations and sometimes in an unfair or a misleading way. Okay, and then another way in which things can go wrong is an oversimplification of data. So data is very complicated, and often it cannot be reduced to a single number or a small group of summary statistics. There's usually, you know, a caveat or additional information that's insightful. But a lot of times this is done. So for example, if you're trying to think about what hotel to stay at, let's say hotel A gets rated, has an average rating of 3.2, and hotel B also has an average rating of 3.2, but hotel A has a mix of mostly 3 and 4s, and hotel B has a mix of mostly 1 and 5s. That's actually very, very different information, and you would probably evaluate those two things very differently if you were given access to that full data instead of just a summary statistic. Okay, I'm going to skip those in the interest of time. Okay, right, and then another thing that can occur is a phenomenon known as diversity suppression. So, and this is this is related to the example we talked about with women being in the minority in the company and that kind of propagating. For example, the world is also dominated by right-handed people, and so a lot of companies will cater to that, and they will build products that are designed to support right-handed people instead of left-handed people. And so what tends to happen in a lot of these situations is that the minority loses, okay? And this is a good graphic to kind of illustrate how this can happen. So let's take a look at this. I know this is a very simple graphic, but let's think about it a little bit. And let's pretend that you have a lot more red points than green points. I know there's only like one more red point than green point, but let's think that red is the majority and green is the minority. And let's say we have some notion of good and bad, and we're trying to build a classifier to distinguish the two. Well, if the classifier is trained on data that's majority red, what is it going to do? It's going to say, well, I think if I'm above this line, I'm probably good. And if I'm below this line, I'm probably bad. Now, what do you notice about what that classifier is going to do on the minority group, on the green group? Is the opposite, right? So it turns out that the pattern is reversed on the minority group. Who knows why? But let's say that it's quite possible the pattern is reversed on the minority group. So this has real consequences. And what might this look like in practice? Well, so going back to hiring, let's say we use data science to find promising prospects, but the criteria that we're using, our classifier or our way of scoring applicants is basically fit to the majority. So the characteristics that are good predictors of success tend to be those that are good predictors of success for the majority. And so the algorithm can actually have not a very high predictive performance if it's restricted just to the minority. And there's basically two sad things that happen in this case. The first is that the best minority applicants are not hired because they're not even, detected by this algorithm. If the pattern is reversed, then the best minority applicants may not be getting the highest scores. And that's unfair to them because they don't get hired. And then the second sad thing that happens is that the minority candidates who are hired, they may not have been the best ones, right? They may actually not have been the most promising candidates to hire. So then maybe their performance is not as good as it would have been for the best candidates. And so it can sort of propagate, not having the most exceptional minority candidates in the position. Okay. And so you can also think about what the effects of this would be in the medical context. Let's say we are looking at a drug, a clinical trial of a new drug. And let's say we have two groups. We have group A, and the drug is very effective for group A. And then we have group B, and let's say the drug is not at all effective for group B. So let's think through what's going to happen if, let's say group A is the majority and the drug is very effective for group A. So what's going to happen in the clinical trial of the drug, and how is it going to affect group B? Any thoughts? So this is case one. So it's really effective for group A, and group A is in the majority. Well, if group A is in the majority, it's going to dominate the effect of the trial, and the drug will be found effective because it's effective for the majority, and so it will yield effective, statistically significant, effective with a suitable significance level. However, it's not effective for patients in group B, but they'll probably also be given the drug, even though it's not effective for them. So this is sort of a loss for the minority because they're given a drug that's not effective for them. And then the other thing that could happen is that, group B could be the majority group. The drug could not be effective for group B. And so in the study, it's found to be ineffective because it doesn't work for the majority. And so it's never even put to market, and the minority population never gets access to this drug that might be really, really effective for them. So there's kind of two ways in which the minority group can lose out. Okay. And then another misuse that can happen is p-hacking, which we talked on briefly in class. So I probably won't go into a whole lot of details on this one, but let's remember, actually, let's recap here. What is a p-value? Remember, this is in the context of a hypothesis test. We have a null hypothesis, and we have an alternate hypothesis. What does the p-value quantify? Yes.
The probability of getting the observed value if the null hypothesis is true.
Very good. So the probability of getting the observed value, assuming the null hypothesis is true. Okay. And so, for example, if you had a Gaussian distribution, and let's say we're going to use a cutoff of 0.05 for our alpha value. If you really had if you really had that setup using a cutoff of 0.05, 5% of the time, you're actually, it's going to happen just by chance that you reject the null hypothesis, even when you shouldn't. Just the way that the nature of the way the test is set up. It's set up in such a way that you would kind of draw this incorrect conclusion. If the null hypothesis really were true, you would still draw this like incorrect conclusion 5% of the time. And so you can discover effects that are significant, but may not actually be there. Okay, so let me maybe skip some of that, but so p-hacking is when we just do a bunch of hypothesis tests, and we will find patterns, we will find effects, but are they really valid? Requires further investigation. And one good thing to do might be to, again, kind of split the data into parts and do some exploratory analysis on one part to come up with your hypotheses, and then on the other part actually do some tests of statistical significance, and that can help mitigate this. And there's also more complicated ways you can set up hypothesis tests to test multiple hypotheses. Okay. So let's maybe skip that also in the interest of time. Okay, so just to kind of summarize what we've discussed in terms of algorithmic fairness. So humans have many biases. No human is perfectly fair, even with the best of intentions. And I don't know if algorithms are better or worse than humans, but at least biases in algorithms are usually easier to measure, which is one positive thing, even if the outcome is no fairer. So yeah, there's a lot to think about along these lines. So some of the things that we've seen is often algorithms can tend to propagate the status quo. They're highly dependent on the training data that was used to feed M to them. And it's really important sort of to think about the consequences of what we're doing as we design and run these algorithms. And although big data can be a way of, well, implementing discrimination, it can also be a way of investigating, of looking for it and trying to mitigate it at the same time. Okay, so let's see. We're almost out of time for today. Do we have time for our little video? Let me see how long this one is. I think we have time. It's 3 minutes.
Variables are often correlated, and one should not be surprised if one finds that while one thinks that one is dealing with some one variable of interest, one is also indirectly dealing with some other variable that one didn't even realize one was dealing with. As an example, consider Staples, the office supply store. That's a competitive thing, simply to win business from their competitors. They decided that they would offer a lower price online to customers who lived near one of their competing competitors' stores.
So you're telling me Staples can give me everything on this list at the lowest prices?
Yep, Staples is 110% price match guarantee for back to school.
So you're telling me the truth?
I 110% guarantee you I'm telling the truth.
So if, for example, if you live within a few miles of an Office Max, you would get a lower price online at Staples than if you were to live not near an Office Max. This seems like a perfectly fine, aggressive, competitive move, and something that we would applaud as good business, potentially. However, further analysis turned out to show that Office Max stores happen to be located in higher income areas, like suburban neighborhoods with bigger houses. And there were no Office Max stores in rural areas or poor neighborhoods. So another way of looking at Staples price discrimination is to say that if you lived in a well-off neighborhood, in a good zip code, you would pay a lower price. But if you lived in a poorer neighborhood, you would pay a higher price at Staples. This was not the intention at all of the Staples executives when they launched this campaign, but this was a consequence that flowed directly from the correlation between the locations of the competitors' stores and the mechanism that they were using to vary the prices online. Of course, once this became an issue, they stopped this particular price discrimination campaign. The point is not so much what Staples did, but how does one think through all the different variables that you could be manipulating without knowing it.
Okay, great. So just to kind of wrap us up for the day, does, I don't know, could that have been prevented? Anybody have any thoughts as to, I mean, Staples clearly didn't mean to discriminate against the poor, right? That was not their intent, but they did. Could that have been prevented? No?
Just like offering better prices to everyone instead of just. Everyone can full price without.
Right, right. So that could have been prevented by just having, you know, like a uniform policy for everybody. You know, we're never going to change prices for any reason. But yeah, and another thing could be just, well, maybe it couldn't have been prevented. Maybe nobody would have thought of it. But maybe if there had been some kind of committee on ethics, you know, if there had been some point along the way where it was somebody's job to think about it, maybe somebody would have noticed, right? So this is something that we can work to kind of build into the pipeline a little bit better. And we're also encouraging you as you're working on your projects to think about it. You know, think about how your projects and how your data analysis, are there any ethical considerations? Is there anybody that's being affected by this? Okay, well, we're out of time for today, so why don't we wrap up there? There are a few slides we didn't get to, especially on societal consequences, but I'll post those and you guys can look through them. So thanks, everybody. And take care, and we'll see you later.